The morning sun hadn't fully risen over Fort Benning when Master Chief Sarah Chin stood at the front of the auditorium with her arms crossed. She was 53 years old, had served 30 years in the Navy SEALs, the first woman ever to achieve the rank, and the tattoo on her forearm had become as famous as she was infamous. But this morning, standing before a new class of 64 cadets, she wasn't thinking about her rank or her legacy. She was thinking about what came next. The recruits filed in slowly, eyes forward, posture rigid. These were the best of the best, young men and women who had passed every physical test, every psychological evaluation, every background check. They were confident. Some of them looked almost invincible in their pressed uniforms and polished boots. Sarah watched them settle into their seats. She noticed the glances. The whispers that stopped as soon as she moved. The way some of the younger instructors deferred to her, while others seemed to bristle at her presence. It had always been this way. 30 years, and it never got easier. The class began with the standard orientation. Physical expectations. Code of conduct. Honor. Duty. Sacrifice. Sarah delivered these words the way she always did, with precision, without emotion, without embellishment. She was a machine made of steel and scar tissue. But then one of the cadets raised his hand. His name was Marcus Webb, and he came from money. Not the kind of money you could spend on nicer things, but the kind that made you feel like the world owed you something. He had that particular kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. "Master Chief," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Can you explain the significance of your tattoo? It's unusual for an officer of your rank to display it so openly." The silence that followed was complete. No one breathed. No one moved. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd been asked this question 1,000 times. Sometimes she answered it. Sometimes she didn't. Today, she decided not to give this young man what he wanted. "That's not relevant to your training, Cadet Webb," she said quietly. "What's relevant is whether you can push yourself harder than you think possible. Whether you can lead men and women who might not respect you. Whether you can make decisions that save lives even when your hands are shaking and your mind is screaming that you can't." Marcus smiled, not respectfully, but smugly, as if she'd just proved his point about her not belonging here. The first week was brutal, as it always was. The cadets ran until their lungs burned. They swam in water so cold it felt like hypothermia creeping in with every stroke. They endured sleep deprivation, physical punishment, psychological stress. They were pushed to the absolute edge of what the human body could tolerate. And they started to break. By day 7, 4 cadets had quit. By day 12, another 6. The ones who remained were harder, sharper, angrier. They looked at Sarah differently now, not with curiosity, but with something that might have been the beginning of respect. But not Marcus Webb. He was doing well, actually. His scores were excellent. He was fast, strong, intelligent. He followed orders and performed perfectly under pressure. But he couldn't let the tattoo go. It became a running joke among his peers. Whenever Sarah was out of earshot, one of the other cadets would point to his arm and whisper, "The old lady's got ink." They'd laugh about it, not loudly enough for Sarah to hear, but loud enough that she always knew. Sarah ignored it. Ignoring things had become one of her superpowers. It was on day 17 when things changed. A cadet named Jennifer Martinez collapsed during a water confidence exercise. She'd been breathing hard all day, and her body simply shut down. Hypothermia setting in. Panic rising. Sarah was there in seconds, pulling Jennifer from the water, recognizing the signs of something more serious than exhaustion. She carried Jennifer to medical while the other instructors continued the exercise. No time to waste. No room for sentiment. Jennifer survived, but barely. She spent 3 days in the base hospital recovering from severe hypothermia and a secondary infection. The doctor said another few minutes in the water and she wouldn't have made it. When Jennifer was released and allowed to return to the program, something had shifted in how the cadets looked at Sarah. They'd seen her move. Really move. Not as an instructor or a symbol, but as someone with actual tactical training, actual combat experience, actual knowledge of how to keep people alive when everything is falling apart. Except Marcus Webb. He was standing with two of his friends near the barracks when Sarah passed by carrying a stack of equipment. She heard him clearly, not bothering to whisper this time. "You know what the ink really means," Marcus said to his friends. "It's a cover-up. Everyone knows she got it to hide some kind of failure. My dad's a lawyer. He told me that kind of thing happens all the time with the military. They cover up their mistakes with medals and tattoos." Sarah kept walking. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But something inside her went very, very still. That night, Sarah sat alone in her small apartment in the town of Phoenix City, Alabama, which sat just across the border from Georgia. The apartment was sparse: a bed, a desk, a kitchen she barely used. No photographs. No personal items. Nothing to suggest that anyone actually lived here. She pulled up her sleeve and looked at the tattoo on her forearm. It was simple, no elaborate designs or intricate details. Just a name, in plain black ink, Lucas. And beneath it, 2 dates. Sarah traced the letters with her finger, the way she did most nights when the base was quiet and she was alone. The ink was faded now, after 30 years, but that didn't matter. She knew every line, every curve, every shadow of black against her skin. The dates marked 11 years of her life. The years she'd been married to Lucas Reeves, who'd been a SEAL before her. Who'd trained her before they fell in love. Who'd died in an operation she was supposed to be on but couldn't because she was 6 months pregnant with their daughter. Everyone knew the story. Or they thought they did. Sarah laid back on her bed and stared at the ceiling. Marcus Webb's words echoed in her mind. A cover-up. A mistake. A failure. She closed her eyes and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would tell them. She would tell all 64 cadets what that tattoo meant. She would stand in front of that class and speak about the weight of love and loss and survival. She would be vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in decades. And if they laughed at her for it, well, at least then she'd know who they really were. The night pressed in around her, silent and heavy. Sarah Chen, the first female Navy SEAL, the woman who had spent 30 years proving herself to people who would never believe she belonged, finally decided to stop proving anything. The auditorium was arranged differently this time. The 60 remaining cadets sat in a semicircle instead of rows. Sarah had changed the setup intentionally. She wanted them to see her face. She wanted to see theirs. It was morning again, just like the first day, but everything felt different. Sarah had barely slept. Her nerves were jangled. For the first time in 3 decades, she felt unprepared. She stood in the center of the semicircle and took a long breath. "Before we start today's training," she began, "I want to address something that's been brought to my attention." She paused, letting her eyes scan across the group. "Some of you have questions about my tattoo. And I've decided that you deserve answers." She rolled up her sleeve slowly, deliberately, so everyone could see the name and the dates clearly. "This is Lucas Reeves," she said quietly. "He was my husband. He was also the officer who first trained me as a SEAL candidate. Many of you probably don't know that there was a time when the Navy didn't think women belonged in this program. Lucas believed differently. He spent his own time training me, pushing me, believing in me before I believed in myself." Sarah's voice remained steady, but her hands told a different story. They were trembling slightly. "We were married for 11 years. We had a daughter named Emma. On March 15, 1994, Lucas was killed during a covert operation in Somalia. He was 34 years old." The auditorium was absolutely silent. Even the HVAC system seemed to quiet down. I got this tattoo, Sarah continued, touching the ink on her forearm, the day of his funeral. Not because I was trying to hide something. Not because I made a mistake or failed in some way. I got it because I wanted to carry him with me every single day for the rest of my life. So that every time I put on this uniform, I would remember that I'm not just doing this job for myself. I'm doing it for him. For everyone like him who believed in doing the impossible. She lowered her sleeve carefully. Over the past few days, I've heard some rumors about what this tattoo means. I've heard suggestions that it's a cover-up for some kind of failure. I'm telling you all right now, that's not true. The only failure here is the failure to ask respectfully before you judge. The failure to seek to understand before you decide who belongs and who doesn't. Sarah looked directly at Marcus Webb. I've spent my entire career proving that I'm competent. That I'm brave. That I deserve this rank and this position. And I've done that job extremely well. But I shouldn't have to keep proving it. Not to you. Not to anyone. I earned my place in this program the same way every other person in this auditorium earned theirs, through sacrifice, dedication, and the willingness to die for the person standing next to you. Marcus was looking down at his hands. His face had gone pale. I'm telling you this story not because I need your pity, Sarah went on. I don't. I'm telling you because one of the most important lessons you will ever learn as a member of this team is that we never judge anyone's strength by looking at their surface. We never assume we understand someone else's journey. And we never, spread rumors or make jokes about things we don't understand. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Lucas taught me that. And I want to teach it to you. The training that day was different. When the cadets were running, they were running harder. When they were swimming faster. When they were facing obstacles, they were facing them with something that looked like purpose. By evening, Marcus Webb requested a private meeting with Sarah. He met her in her office, which was as spare and impersonal as her apartment. No decorations. No mementos. Just functional furniture and the faint smell of salt water from the training grounds. Master Chief, Marcus began, and his voice had lost all of its smugness. I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I was disrespectful, and I was making assumptions that I had no right to make. Sarah studied him for a long moment. She'd been doing this long enough to know when an apology was genuine and when it was performative. This one seemed real, but she wasn't ready to make things easy. Why were you doing that? She asked. Marcus took a breath. I think I was threatened by you, he said slowly. My whole life, I've been the best at everything. In school, in sports, in everything. And then I got here, and I met you, and you were clearly better than me. Stronger than me. More experienced than me. And instead of learning from that, I tried to tear you down by focusing on something superficial. Something that had nothing to do with your actual qualifications. And why did that feel necessary? Sarah pressed. Because if I could make you seem less than, Marcus said quietly, then maybe I wouldn't feel so small. Sarah nodded slowly. It was honest. It was the kind of honesty that made growth possible. That's better, she said. You've just learned one of the most important lessons of your career. And you learned it on day 18 instead of day 200. That's good progress. Can I ask you something? Marcus said. How did you? I mean, after losing someone like that, how did you keep going? How did you come back to this work? Sarah considered the question carefully. I didn't keep going immediately, she admitted. I took 3 years off. I raised Emma. I worked civilian jobs. I tried to pretend that I didn't need this. She gestured around the sparse office. But the truth is, I did need it. I needed to finish what Lucas and I started. I needed to prove to every young woman who comes through this program that it's possible. That we belong here. And I needed to do it so well, so completely, that no one would ever question it again. Did it work? Marcus asked. Are there more women now? Did things change? Somewhat, Sarah said. We have more women in the program than we did 30 years ago. But we still have a long way to go. We still have people who think women don't belong in combat roles. We still have people who judge based on appearances instead of abilities. We still have people like you, Cadet Webb, who tear others down instead of lifting them up. She let that land. The question is, she continued, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to learn from this mistake and become a better leader? Or are you going to justify it and move on? I want to be better, Marcus said. And he meant it. Then you'll have to earn it, Sarah replied. Not with me. With yourself. And with the other cadets. That night, Sarah received a message on her personal phone. It was from Jennifer Martinez, the cadet who'd collapsed during the water exercise. Thank you, the message said, for telling us about Lucas. I'm sorry I never asked before judging. You're right, we never know what someone else is carrying. I lost my brother last year to suicide. I never told anyone. But listening to you talk about loss and still showing up, it helped. Thank you for that. Sarah stared at the message for a long time before responding. Keep showing up, she typed back. For yourself. For your brother's memory. That's what it's all about. She hit send and set the phone down. The apartment felt smaller somehow. Emptier. But in a different way than before. Not the emptiness of solitude, but the emptiness of a space about to be filled with something new. Sarah pulled up her sleeve again and looked at Lucas's name. We did it, she whispered to the tattoo, to the man who'd believed in her first. I'm finally letting them know what we did. Through the window of her small apartment, she could see the lights of the training grounds in the distance. 60 strong bodies, pushing themselves to the limit. And tomorrow, they'd push even harder. 2 weeks passed after Sarah's revelation, and the entire dynamic of the program had shifted. The cadets trained with new intensity, not because they were afraid of Sarah, but because they'd started to understand what they were training for. They were training to become the kind of leaders who could inspire rather than diminish. Who could build people up instead of tearing them down. But Sarah wasn't ready to let them think they'd learned everything they needed to know. Week 4 was always the hardest. It was the week where most of the remaining cadets would quit. It was the week where minds broke more than bodies did. Sarah had planned this week carefully, working with the other instructors to push the cadets to the absolute limit of their psychological endurance. They would be sleep-deprived. Confused. Emotionally vulnerable. And in that vulnerable state, they would have to make decisions that would determine whether they could lead or whether they would crumble. The week began on a Monday morning with no warning. Every cadet was pulled from their bunk at 4 a.m, dressed in full gear within 3 minutes, and loaded onto trucks heading to the mountains 50 miles away. They had no idea where they were going or what they were doing. They only knew that Sarah had told them to be ready. Once they arrived at the remote training camp, things got worse. For the next 72 hours, the cadets would be given incomplete information about a tactical scenario. They would have to make decisions without knowing the full picture. They would have to trust their instincts while their exhaustion tried to convince them that everything was hopeless. Sarah moved through the camp like a ghost, watching, assessing, taking notes. She said very little. When she did speak, her voice was even and cold, designed to push rather than comfort. By hour 48, 3 more cadets had quit. By hour 60, another 2. The remaining 50 cadets were running on fumes. Some of them were hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Others had broken down crying and then pulled themselves back together to keep going. And then, at hour 65, Jennifer Martinez collapsed. But this time, it wasn't hypothermia or exhaustion. It was a leg injury, a torn ligament that she'd apparently injured the day before but had hidden because she was afraid of failing the program. Sarah was there in seconds, the way she'd been before. But this time, instead of just providing medical care, Sarah made a different choice. "Cadet Martinez," she said quietly, kneeling beside the injured woman. "I need you to make a decision. Do you want to quit, or do you want to keep going?" Jennifer's face was twisted in pain. "I can't walk, Master Chief. I'm done." "That's not what I asked," Sarah said. "I asked if you want to quit. Your leg doesn't make that decision. You do." "Master Chief," Jennifer started. "I was injured in the field once," Sarah interrupted. "Broken ankle. We were still 30 kilometers from extraction, and the enemy was closing in. I couldn't walk either. But I could crawl. And I could keep crawling until someone got to me. So the question remains, do you want to quit, or do you want to find another way?" Jennifer looked at Sarah for a long moment, then at the other cadets gathered around. She saw Marcus Webb kneeling in the dirt, sweat and dirt covering his face. She saw others who were equally broken, equally exhausted, equally terrified. "I don't want to quit," Jennifer whispered. "Then we're going to splint this leg, and you're going to crawl," Sarah said. "And those cadets who are still standing are going to help you. Because that's what we do. We don't leave anyone behind." What happened over the next 6 hours became the stuff of legend in the SEAL program. Jennifer Martinez, with a torn ligament, crawled across rough terrain with the help of 4 other cadets who rotated in shifts. The entire group moved forward together, refusing to leave anyone behind. Even when Sarah told them they could abandon her and save themselves points, they refused. By the time they reached the final checkpoint, every single one of the remaining 50 cadets was broken in some way. Blistered feet. Dehydrated bodies. Minds barely holding on to coherence. But all 50 of them were there. Sarah gathered them around a fire, the first warmth they'd felt in days, and sat down beside them. She didn't speak for a long time. She just sat, letting the reality of what they'd done sink in. Finally, she spoke. "What you just did," she said, "is the entire point of this program. You didn't survive because you were the strongest or the smartest. You survived because you refused to leave each other behind. You survived because you learned to trust people you just met days before. You survived because you understood that your strength isn't individual, it's collective." She looked at Marcus Webb. "You," she said, "carried Martinez for the last kilometer when your own legs were failing." "Why?" "Because we don't leave people behind," Marcus said. It wasn't bravado anymore. It was fact. "Exactly," Sarah said. "That's what separates a team from a collection of individuals. And that's what Lucas tried to teach me when I was where you are right now." She stood up slowly, her 63-year-old body protesting every movement. "You have all earned the right to wear this uniform," Sarah said. "But you haven't earned the right to lead. That comes later, with every decision you make to put someone else's safety before your own comfort. With every choice to speak truth even when it's unpopular. With every moment you decide that your team's victory is more important than your personal advancement." Jennifer Martinez, lying on a stretcher with her leg properly splinted, raised her hand slightly. "Master Chief," she said. "What happened to Lucas? I mean, you've told us how he died, but, did they ever get his body back? Did his family have closure?" The fire crackled. Sarah stared into it for a long moment. "His body was recovered," she said. "We brought him home. His parents were there. Our daughter was there. I placed a flag over his casket, and then I had to walk away because there was another operation that needed commanding." She turned to look directly at Jennifer. "I didn't take time to grieve properly," she said. "I told myself there wasn't time. That I had too much responsibility. That I had to be strong for everyone else. So I threw myself into my work and wore his name on my skin as a way to avoid actually dealing with the fact that he was gone." The cadets watched her carefully. It took me 15 years, Sarah continued, to realize that mourning isn't weakness. That allowing yourself to feel lost doesn't make you a bad leader. That in fact, the leaders who pretend they don't feel anything are the ones who make the worst decisions in the field. She pulled up her sleeve again and looked at Lucas's name. That's why I'm telling you all this now, she said. Because I want you to understand that strength doesn't mean being invulnerable. It means being strong enough to be vulnerable. It means being brave enough to say that something matters to you. It means being a human being, not a machine. The night wore on. The cadets slept where they fell, and Sarah sat watching over them. She'd done this so many times before, sat up all night, watching young people who were learning what it meant to be part of something bigger than themselves. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't watching strangers. She was watching people she'd actually connected with. People who knew her name now, not just her rank. People who understood that the tattoo on her arm wasn't a reminder of weakness. It was a reminder of why she was here at all. As the sun began to rise, Sarah pulled out her phone and called her daughter Emma. "Hey, Mom," Emma answered. She was on the West Coast now, working as a civil rights lawyer. "How's the program going?" "Better than I expected," Sarah said. "I told them about your father." There was a pause on the other end. "How did that feel?" Emma asked finally. "Terrifying," Sarah admitted. "And necessary." "I'm proud of you," Emma said simply. After they hung up, Sarah sat with that statement for a while. Her daughter was proud of her. Not because she was strong or capable or decorated. But because she'd finally let people see that she was human. The program moved into its final weeks with a sense of momentum that Sarah had never experienced before. These 50 cadets had been forged in a way that most never were. They'd learned to trust each other not through trust falls and team-building exercises, but through actual adversity. Through real vulnerability. Through the kind of shared struggle that either breaks you apart or bonds you forever. But Sarah knew that the true test was still coming. It happened on a Thursday afternoon when a representative from Naval Command arrived at the base. His name was Admiral Richard Preston, and he had a reputation for being old school. The kind of leader who believed that women had made the military soft. The kind of officer who still questioned whether they belonged in combat roles. He was there to observe the final evaluation of the cadet program. Sarah knew this would be a test. Not just for the cadets, but for her. The evaluation was designed to be a realistic combat scenario. The cadets would be split into 2 teams. Team A would be tasked with securing a location and defending it. Team B would be tasked with breaching that location and capturing specific objectives. Everything would be monitored. Everything would be judged. Admiral Preston sat in the observation room with a clipboard, watching the live feeds with an expression that suggested he was already unimpressed. The exercise began, and Sarah could see immediately that the cadets had learned their lessons well. Team A set up a strong defensive position, using the terrain and their knowledge of each other's strengths to create a formidable obstacle. Team B moved with precision and coordination, communicating without words, understanding each other's movements before they happened. But then, 40 minutes into the exercise, something unexpected occurred. Marcus Webb, who was leading Team B, made a tactical decision that was unconventional. Instead of following the standard breach protocol that they'd been trained on, he deviated significantly. He sent 3 cadets in through the main entrance to draw fire, a move that would normally be considered reckless, even suicidal, while the bulk of his team moved through a secondary route. The defensive team, including Jennifer Martinez, fell exactly where Marcus predicted they would. Team B achieved their objective in record time. But Admiral Preston stood up, his face darkening. "That's not how we train them to operate," he said to Sarah. "That's improvisation. That's dangerous." Sarah watched the exercise conclude on the monitors. She watched Marcus help Jennifer to her feet after the simulated combat had ended. She watched the 2 teams debrief together, discussing what had worked and what hadn't. And then she turned to face Admiral Preston. "With respect, sir," she said carefully, "that's exactly how we should be training them." The tactical situation Cadet Webb encountered didn't match the standard protocols he learned. So he adapted. He used his knowledge of the defensive team's likely responses to create an advantage. That's not recklessness. That's leadership. That's deviation from protocol, Admiral Preston countered. In the field, deviation from protocol gets people killed. So does strict adherence to protocol when the situation has changed, Sarah replied. The best operators are the ones who can think on their feet. Who can make decisions based on the reality they're facing, not the theory they learned in training. Admiral Preston's jaw tightened. I didn't come here to debate leadership philosophy, Master Chief. I came here to see if this program is producing competent officers. And from what I can see, you've let it become too soft. Too focused on feelings and personal stories instead of hard discipline. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah took a breath. This was the moment. This was everything she'd been preparing for. Sir, she said, her voice quiet and controlled, would you like to know why I focus on personal stories? Admiral Preston didn't respond, but he didn't leave the observation room either. Because personal stories are what keep people alive in the field, Sarah continued. When a soldier is scared and bleeding and wondering if they're going to make it home, they don't think about protocol. They think about the people they love. They think about the team members who've trained beside them. They think about why they're fighting in the first place. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing Lucas's tattoo. I kept this hidden for 30 years, she said. I told myself it was because it wasn't relevant to my job. But the real reason was that I was ashamed. I was ashamed that my husband was more brilliant than I was. I was ashamed that he had to die to prove to the Navy that women belonged in this program. I was ashamed that I survived and he didn't. Admiral Preston stared at her tattoo in silence. But then one of my cadets asked me about it, Sarah continued. Really asked me, with genuine curiosity instead of mockery. And I realized that my shame was preventing these young people from understanding what strength actually is. Strength isn't invulnerability. Strength is carrying forward even when you've lost everything. She lowered her sleeve. Cadet Webb violated protocol today, Sarah said. You're right about that. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give him a commendation. Because he understood something that most officers spend decades trying to learn. He understood that the people around him were more than just team members, they were individuals with their own fears and strengths and capabilities. And he used that understanding to accomplish the mission. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Admiral Preston said quietly. Sentiment has replaced discipline. And now you're rewarding it. No, sir, Sarah said. I'm rewarding leadership. Which is something entirely different. The room went very quiet. Then Admiral Preston did something surprising. He sat down. Not in defeat, but in deliberation. Tell me about your husband, he said. So Sarah did. She told him about Lucas's brilliance and his compassion and his absolute conviction that the military needed to change. She told him about the operation that killed him. She told him about raising Emma alone. She told him about the 3 years she took off, and why she came back. She told him everything. When she finished, Admiral Preston was quiet for a long time. I knew Lucas, he said finally. Not well, but I knew him. He was always going on about how the best operators were the ones who cared about their teams. I thought he was soft. I told him that. He looked at Sarah carefully. I was wrong, he said. Those 4 words changed everything. Over the next hour, Admiral Preston watched the remaining cadet evaluations. But this time, he watched differently. He watched for instances of leadership. For moments of connection between team members. For evidence that these young people understood that combat wasn't just about physical capability, it was about psychological and emotional resilience. And he saw it everywhere. By the end of the day, all 50 cadets had passed their final evaluation. But more importantly, Admiral Preston had changed his mind about something fundamental. He was beginning to understand that the future of the military didn't depend on making soldiers harder and colder. It depended on making them more human. That evening, Sarah received formal notification that she would be promoted to the rank of Vice Admiral. It was the highest position she could reach without taking a desk job at the Pentagon. It was an honor she'd worked for her entire career. But when she got the news, the first thing she thought about wasn't the promotion. It was Jennifer Martinez asking about Lucas. It was Marcus Webb deciding to be better. It was Admiral Preston admitting that he'd been wrong. It was the moment when people started to understand that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites. They were partners. Sarah called Emma again. "They promoted me," she said when her daughter answered. "I know," Emma said. "Admiral Preston's office called me. They wanted to know if I had any statements for the press release. Apparently, he's using your story as part of a military-wide initiative to change how we train leaders." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not pain, but release. Like a weight she'd been carrying for 30 years had finally begun to lift. 3 months after the cadet program ended, Sarah stood in front of a much larger auditorium. This time, it wasn't filled with recruits. It was filled with military officers from bases across the country, journalists, and government officials. Admiral Preston had organized a special conference on military leadership, and the keynote address had been assigned to Vice Admiral Sarah Chen. Her first act as a Vice Admiral. She'd spent weeks preparing the speech, working with Emma to help her structure her thoughts. Not the story of Lucas, everyone knew that now. But the story of what came after. The story of how loss could become purpose. How shame could become strength. Sarah stepped to the podium in her dress uniform, the new insignia of her rank gleaming on her shoulders. The auditorium had capacity for 800 people, and every seat was full. She looked out at the faces watching her, some skeptical, some supportive, most simply curious. And she began. "My husband died 30 years ago," she said. "He died because he believed in something that the military wasn't ready to believe in yet. He believed that the best operators weren't the ones who were the coldest or the most invulnerable. He believed that the best operators were the ones who could connect with the people around them. Who could lead not through fear, but through understanding." She paused, letting that sink in. "For a long time after he died, I thought he was wrong," she continued. "I thought I had to spend my career proving that I could be just as hard and just as emotionally distant as any man. I thought that if I showed any sign of the grief I was carrying, people would use it as evidence that women didn't belong in combat roles. That we were too emotional. Too soft. Too weak." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing the tattoo. "I wore his name on my body every single day," she said. "And I told almost no one why. Because I thought the reason was weakness. But I was wrong. The reason wasn't weakness. The reason was love. And love, despite what popular culture tells us, is not the opposite of strength. Love is what gives strength meaning." The auditorium was absolutely silent. "Over the past few months," Sarah went on, "I've had the privilege of working with 50 new cadets. These 50 individuals went through a program that pushed them to the absolute limits of their physical and psychological endurance. And you know what I learned from watching them? I learned that the strongest among them weren't necessarily the fastest runners or the best shooters. The strongest among them were the ones who understood that their own survival was directly connected to everyone else's survival." She pointed out into the audience. "Colonel Martinez is here today," Sarah said. "She was one of my cadets. During her training, she suffered a torn ligament but chose to push forward anyway. You know why? Because she understood that quitting affected more than just herself. It affected the entire team." Jennifer Martinez stood, and the audience applauded. Sarah saw tears on her face. And in the back of the auditorium, Sarah continued, is Major Marcus Webb. 6 months ago, Major Webb was a cadet who was quick to judge what he didn't understand. But he was brave enough to admit when he was wrong. He was strong enough to become better. And that's the kind of officer who changes cultures. That's the kind of officer who saves lives. Marcus Webb stood as well, and there was genuine warmth in the applause this time. Sarah could see the surprise on his face, not at being recognized, but at being recognized for growth rather than excellence. This is the future of military leadership, Sarah said. It's not about having the most medals or the highest scores. It's about having the courage to be human. The strength to admit mistakes. The wisdom to learn from people who are different from you. She lowered her sleeve. My husband believed that, she said. And I'm spending my career making sure that belief becomes reality. The rest of the speech covered specific initiatives, new training programs that would emphasize emotional intelligence alongside tactical skill. New policies for evaluating leadership that took into account interpersonal effectiveness. New mentorship programs that would pair experienced officers with younger ones specifically to teach the human element of command. By the time Sarah finished, the standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes straight. Afterward, there was a reception where admirals and generals wanted to shake her hand. Where journalists wanted interviews. Where young officers, many of them women, wanted to tell her that her story had changed something fundamental about how they saw their own place in the military. But Sarah excused herself as soon as she could. She had somewhere else she needed to be. Phoenix City was only about an hour's drive from the base. Sarah made the drive in silence, no music, just the sound of the road beneath her tires and her own thoughts. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon sun. She hadn't been there in 6 months, longer than usual. The guilt of that had been part of what kept her isolated for so long. The belief that not visiting often enough meant she wasn't grieving properly. She found Lucas's grave easily, even though she hadn't been in a long time. His headstone was simple, like he would have wanted. No elaborate inscriptions. Just his name, his dates, and the words that she'd had carved there years ago. He believed we could be better. Sarah sat down on the grass beside the stone and looked at her reflection in her polished shoe. Vice Admiral Chen. It sounded strange. It sounded like someone else. I did it, Luke, she said aloud, not caring if anyone saw her talking to a grave. I did it the way you would have wanted. Not by being cold. By being real. She pulled up her sleeve one more time and looked at his name. I'm not wearing you as a burden anymore, she said. I'm wearing you as a promise. A promise that every person I train is going to understand what you understood. That leadership isn't about power over people. It's about power with people. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah sat there until the light started to fade, not thinking about anything in particular, just being present in the moment. Being present with the grief that had defined her for so long, but that no longer had to control her. When she finally stood to leave, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, she would never forget Lucas, would never want to. But the peace of integrating what had happened into who she was, without letting it be the only thing she was. She drove back to the base as the stars came out. The radio played softly, nothing important, just background. And she thought about the next program of cadets. The ones who would come through her training with the new understanding of what strength meant. The ones who would take those lessons into the field and potentially save lives because they understood that their team wasn't just a collection of individuals, but a living, breathing organism that required emotional intelligence to function. That was Lucas's legacy now. That was her legacy. When she got back to her sparse apartment, there was a message waiting from her daughter. I watched the keynote, Emma had written. I cried. Dad would have cried too. And Mom. I'm so proud of you. Not because you made Vice Admiral. But because you finally let us see who you really are. That took more courage than anything else you've ever done. Sarah read the message 3 times, letting the words settle into the spaces inside her that had been empty for so long. She pulled out her laptop and sent an email to the commandant of the SEAL training program. "I would like to propose," she wrote, "an annual award named after Lucas Reeves. It would be given to the cadet in each program who best demonstrates the integration of tactical excellence with emotional intelligence and team leadership. The criteria would focus not on the highest scores, but on evidence of genuine growth, willingness to admit mistakes, and commitment to bringing out the best in other team members." She hit send before she could overthink it. That night, Sarah slept through without waking. No nightmares. No restlessness. Just deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that only comes when you finally put down something you've been carrying for far too long. The next morning brought confirmation that the Lucas Reeves Award would be implemented starting with the next cycle of cadets. It would be part of the permanent fabric of the program now. A reminder, every single year, that the strongest leaders were the ones brave enough to be human. 2 weeks later, Jennifer Martinez called with news. She'd been selected to lead the next cycle of cadets through preliminary training. She would be bringing the lessons she'd learned from Sarah to a whole new generation. And a week after that, Marcus Webb reached out to say that he'd been assigned to work as Sarah's aide in the new leadership initiative. He wanted to learn more. He wanted to carry the message forward. The momentum that had started with one woman telling the truth about her tattoo had begun to spread. It would take years to fully shift the culture of the military. There would be resistance. There would be people who believed that emotion and combat operations didn't mix. But Sarah Chen had learned something fundamental, that change doesn't require everyone to believe in you. It just requires enough people. And once you have enough people believing, the whole system starts to shift. She was no longer the woman who hid her grief under a uniform. She was the woman who wore her heart on her skin and dared anyone to tell her that made her weak.